Today I saw something on Twitter which really caught my eye. I must admit I've become a real user of Twitter a lot over the years. I've stopped reading newspapers, which is sad for the newspaper industry, but I find that on Twitter, I don't participate in it much, but I like to read it, and I find it's a great aggregator of all the news that's going on, as long as you don't get too wrapped up in it. But anyways, here was this tweet that came through this morning. It was a beauty. And it was Bloomberg. Trump's estranged niece in her new book depicts a man trained in deception and braggadocio by a distant and dysfunctional father. I just love that word, braggadocio. It sounds Italian. I mean, it's got an Italian ending. And if you actually look at what it means, according to the dictionary, braggadocio means boastful or arrogant behaviour. And that word's always resonated with me. My mother actually used to use it. And my mother, when I was a kid, I can always remember her saying to me, "Peter, pride comes before a fall." To be honest with you, I think that held me back a little when I was young. I was too scared of putting my head up that it'd get knocked down because this pride was always going to come before a fall. But I understand, and I understood a little later, that what she was saying there was be aware of this arrogance. There's nothing wrong with being proud. There's nothing wrong with being proud of your achievements, but it was the arrogance that you had to watch out for. And of course, if you've been in this place long enough, you tend to see popular culture trends come, go, and come back again, all with a slightly different twist. But anyway, my mother's advice when I was growing up was always sound. But I'll tell you what used to always amaze me was, well, you didn't get much more boastful than this fellow here. I mean, Cassius Clay, when he was young, was brash, arrogant, confident. But I think at the time, you thought, yeah, he's got pride, but was a fall coming? And obviously, once he became Muhammad Ali and he really showed his conviction and he wouldn't go to the war and he was prepared to go to jail and he was prepared to lose his title and he was prepared to come back, you realise that the man stood for something. And maybe all that false bravado, being the greatest, was actually part of an act, whilst actually sincerely deep down he actually was a really nice guy. So the greatest, and as he was called, and obviously as he died, he was still known as the greatest. And then came the 80s, and of course that was the time of Gordon Gekko and Greed is Good. And at about that point, I suppose, you could see that in popular culture the tilt wasn't too far away. And in my mother's eyes, Gordon Gekko would have been someone that she would have said, there's a braggadocio. And time, and in his case, pride is definitely going to come before a fall. And of course, as the movie would have it, that's exactly what took place. And then at about that time, Naomi Campbell started to exhibit the most arrogant behaviour, where in this instance she was convicted and almost went to jail for throwing a phone at her personal assistant. And it was at about that point that the world tired of braggadocio. The world had had enough of being too arrogant. And so much so that it became a celebrity to start helping others. And Mother Teresa and Lady Di, or Princess Diana, became feted during that whole period. And they certainly weren't braggadocio. If you think about it, they perhaps, particularly Princess Diana, got as much exposure and got as much opportunity. But you could see there was goodness, or you could feel, or you could sense, or you wanted to sense or believe that there was goodness in their hearts. And so braggadocio was definitely something you would never have labelled those guys with. But then came the 2000s, and then all of a sudden braggadocio started coming back into vogue. And at about the time of the Kardashians, and a number of others at this point, greed was becoming good again. Arrogance was becoming good again. Being noticed was becoming good again. Being extreme was becoming good again. Having an opinion was becoming good again. So much so that, as we know, Trumpism as we know it started to appear, and very alt-right behaviour started being accepted and almost normalised. And in today's Twitter feed, the same day as the niece of the president saying that he was braggadocio, here was, Mr. Scaramucci, Anthony Scaramucci, who did work for the Braggadocio, who said in his, every once in a while, like your mother told you or your grandmother told you, sometimes people get what they deserve. It is nice to see that the negative karma that he generated in our society is coming back upon him, said Anthony Scaramucci on Steve Bannon's arrest, who was the Braggadocio in arms co-pilot. And isn't that interesting? Whether it's Scaramucci had an Italian mother and an Italian grandmother, but he obviously too got told that pride came before a fall. Now, if you look at today's Twitter feed, and here we are now in Australian conditions, and Peter Van Onselen, who writes for the News Corp, he goes, I sometimes seriously wonder if our Prime Minister thinks before he opens his mouth and makes pronouncements he constantly has to walk back from. It happens too often to just be mistaken moments in time. It's pretty ridiculous, frankly. So he's questioning out our Prime Minister, who this week couldn't help himself but indicated that he'd signed a deal on a vaccine for all Australian people. But of course it wasn't soon after that all sorts of holes started to appear with this particular deal. So just maybe this brash arrogance, this braggadocio, is starting to catch up with people. And just maybe this pendulum's starting to swing the other way. And it's interesting that on Fridays, this is how much contempt exists in Australian Parliament, at least, is on Friday is known as Take Out the Garbage Day. The whole idea of take out the bad news, or take out when you've got to correct something, or take out when you've got to walk back on something, like the Treasurer Josh Frydenberg had to walk back on the JobKeeper, which he was telling Australians was going to cost $70 billion, and not the $130 billion that they had projected, to just show how bad his books were. So you bring that out on a Friday because our media's lazy, our society's lazy, our community's lazy, and by Monday they will have forgotten all about it. But do we forget about it? Is Braggadocio still alive and well on the Monday and the Tuesday and the Wednesday? I think the pendulum has swung. I think the pendulum's heading back towards at least the centre line, possibly even left of centre. I'm thinking all of a sudden boastful and arrogant behaviour may not be in vogue. And in marketing, you need to be cognizant of this. In marketing and sales, you need to, by all means, acknowledge and see where the mindset is at, where people are at. And you have to reflect your values and your announcements accordingly. So, braggadocio. Pride comes before a fall. Is it an Italian word? Well, actually, it's not. It actually came from the Fairy Queen, which was written by, oh God, I'm not even sure whom, but it was from the Fairy Queen. It's a long poem, and it was actually about knights in shining armour. And one of the knights was Braggadocio. And I haven't read the poem. I don't even know who wrote it. Spencer, that's who it was. Spencer wrote it. And I'm sure if I was to plough through this, back in 1590s it was written, I'm imagining the night called Braggadocio probably didn't end too well. Yes, I love Twitter. It brings all sorts of ideas to mind. But one thing's for sure and certain. I think the day of the Braggadocio is all but over.